Defender's Office. I tried my first trial in the San Francisco Hall of Justice, a felony, no less, and got an acquittal, no less, and had to fight like hell to get that. I got exposed to the harm that the criminal justice system was creating at that time. I represented veterans, I represented juveniles, and learned about PTSD, and really got a real broad view. I went to the parole board, which we often weren't able to do that, but I had clients who were innocent of the crime for which they were arrested, but because they were on parole, their parole could be revoked. And I never forget my experience of going to the parole board and saying, look, this guy, he didn't do anything. And they're just looking at me, laughing at me because I had no role to play. The only lawyer who was allowed to speak was the district attorney. And so in 2017, when I was asked, urged, compelled to run for district attorney, I understood the power that the district attorney has to make change. And I certainly understand what it means to be a progressive prosecutor. And I concur with Chesa's comments that that term has been co-opted, and no place more than in Alameda County do I hear people saying, oh, I'm a progressive, and they have no commitment whatsoever to progressive values. And for me, as a progressive, what it means to be is first a commitment to addressing racial injustices. And certainly as a Black woman, I understand that. It is in me, and I stand as a proud, unapologetically Black female who has been blessed and privileged to be well educated and to walk into places where we are not normally allowed to be. And I don't have a problem with that. And that includes the Alameda County District Attorney's Office. So it's a commitment to dramatically funding reentry services, because as Chesa pointed out, we have to look back. We cannot pretend like this criminal justice system has not decimated communities of color, that we have not ruined generations of families by over punishing people and over sentencing people. We have got to make a real commitment to repairing the harms of mass incarceration, a commitment to police accountability, which Alameda County is desperate for. A commitment to reimagining youth justice. We got to follow the science. We got to stop branding kids as criminals for a lifetime. Brian Stevenson says in Equal Justice, or Just Mercy, none of us want to be judged by the worst thing we've ever done in our lives in one instant. And that's what we do with juveniles when we brand them and we incarcerate them at 14, 15, 16 years old, which is happening in Alameda County. 86% of all juvenile felony arrests in Alameda County are Black or brown children. 86% of all juvenile felony arrests in Alameda County are Black or brown children. And that has been going on for decades. Those are the things that have to be stopped and addressed. And we have to be very clear about who is prepared to address those things and how. So I thank you for the opportunity to speak and to participate in this conversation. Thank you.
Pamela, thank you for all the important work you've done over the years, and really honored that you're ready and willing to jump into another political race to fight it out. So thank you for that. Sajid, your turn.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you to our organizers, the California Progressive Alliance, and to Whitney and to Jake for facilitating this conversation, and to Matt for hosting us. And it's a great honor to be with Chesa, who I've gotten to know over the past couple of years and have had some really powerful conversations with. And it's a real honor to meet you, Pamela. Also, thank you for your willingness to serve and to answer the bell and to meet this moment in Alameda County. My name is Sajid Khan. I am the son of Muslim immigrants from India who came to the United States in the 1960s and ultimately settled here in the Bay Area in 1980. And I was born shortly thereafter here in San Jose, where I sit today. I was born here, raised here, grew up in San Jose, went to public schools at San Jose High School, and then went to UC Berkeley, and then law school at UC Hastings in San Francisco, and have returned back to San Jose, where I live now, and I work and I raise my 2 sons. I've served my community here in Santa Clara County for the last 12 and a half years as a deputy public defender, working at the Santa Clara County Hall of Justice and at the Santa Clara County Juvenile Hall, serving our community by handling every type of case that a public defender can handle, from misdemeanor DUIs to domestic violence cases, representing our kids in juvenile court, but also in adult court when our district attorney has prosecuted them as adults. I've helped in the representation of people facing the death penalty. I currently handle homicide cases where people are subject to life without the possibility of parole sentences. I've also handled gang cases and 3 strikes cases, and seen it all. And so through that experience, I've seen how this system operates, but I also see how it fails all of us, how it fails to keep us safe, how it perpetuates systemic racism, how it perpetuates mass incarceration, and the dehumanization of Black lives. I've seen how it separates families and how it leaves generational trauma on the people here in Santa Clara County. And with that has come a commitment to effect and enact criminal justice transformation here in Santa Clara County. I am, just to correct Whitney, I'm not a candidate yet, at least, for Santa Clara County DA, but I do believe that there is a call to service here in this county, and there is a moment that we all need to meet to ensure that the progressive values that I'm about to outline are truly manifested in our county, because they have been missing for the duration of my time as a public defender here in Santa Clara County and for decades before that. So with that experience, I have come to know and recognize what true progressive prosecution means. True progressive prosecution requires wholesale, bold, dramatic reform in how prosecutors view people accused of law violations, how they adjudicate and punish violent crime, and how they pursue convictions. Progressive prosecution must mean a change in culture and priorities in DA's offices. So I've come to define progressive prosecution as a model of prosecution committed to truth-telling about systemic racism, shrinking mass criminalization, addressing root causes of crime, and bringing the criminal legal system in line with basic notions of justice and humanity. And flowing from the comments that Pamela and Chesa have already so articulately made, from that definition flows a commitment to humanity, safety, and dignity of all people, including those who have done harm. And it's a commitment to not measuring justice by terms and years of incarceration. It's a commitment to alleviating the suffering in our community, not adding to or exacerbating them through our systems of mass incarceration and police violence. When we think about policies, I know, Matt, you've mentioned trying to be as specific as possible. We see true progressive prosecution in places like San Francisco and now in LA, where it's not just talk, it's not just decriminalizing marijuana or low-level drug offenses. It means no longer pursuing or using the death penalty, no longer prosecuting kids as adults, no more condemning people to life without the possibility of parole sentences, stopping the use of racist gang enhancements and 3-strike enhancements that prey on communities of color in our state. A true commitment to diversion and to a different way and approach to charging decisions. No longer engaging in things like the trial tax, where people are punished for exercising their rights to a trial. No longer engaging in coercive plea bargaining, where prosecutors lean on vulnerable people who are sitting in our jails in order to extract convictions from them. And then, as Pamela and Chesa have alluded to and said already, truly being independent from law enforcement, police agencies, and holding police accountable when they violate the dignity of our fellow human beings and when they violate our Constitution. So that's what I believe is a true measure or standard of progressive prosecution. Anyone who claims to be progressive needs to meet those values and meet those policies. Otherwise, they just don't get to use that term as they walk in our communities. Thank you, Matt, and I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you for that, Sajid. Pamela, maybe we can go to the second question, and I think I'm going to try to weave in a couple of the questions that we're getting from folks who are watching this online. The Black Lives Matter movement, the defund the police movement, certainly are important movements and have a lot of meaning and significant support among progressives that are key to, any campaign such as this, a citywide or countywide campaign for district attorney. So I think that the question is, what practically does it mean if you're a prosecutor to both harness that energy, but also honor those movements? Once you're in a campaign, once you get elected, things like that. A couple of the questions that are coming up in the comments, one of them relates to, the question of pretextual stops, whether or not this is something that can only be addressed with statewide legislation, or whether or not, a district attorney could take that on in some fashion, given the impacts on Black and Brown residents. So maybe I'll turn it over to you, and feel free to use up to 5 minutes to answer that. I know there's a lot to talk about there.
Thank you. I want to make sure I honor the time as well. Certainly the movement for Black Lives Matter is not new, and defund the police is an iteration of that. And these are things that have profound impacts for public policy. And our challenge as people in these positions and having these opportunities to have voices around this is to make sure that we develop policies that actually reflect the sentiment of our communities. And certainly in Alameda County, my county has supported over these last few years the progressive legislation. We voted to pass overwhelmingly measures that reflect the spirit of Black Lives Matter, whether it be Prop 47 or Prop 57. And so as a prosecutor, I can see two ways in which I can carry that ball forward in my day-to-day activities. And one, and certainly Chesa can speak to this, one is having, as a prosecutor, you do have this relationship with law enforcement, and prosecutors have struggled with it. We see how it's worked in the past. As in my vision of it is that I get to be a leader and challenging and helping law enforcement agencies reframe how they actually are enforcing the law. I mean, when I talk about 86% of all Black and Brown children are juvenile felony arrests, I want to know who's doing this. Where is this happening? I get to ask those questions. I get to deal with racial profiling. And so it's great to have a state law, but at the end of the day, it's the local place. That's where the implementation is going to take place. And so as the prosecutor in a county, I get to deal with every law enforcement agency and say, I need to understand, why are you bringing me these cases? How did this happen? Where is it happening? And I get to say to the chief, I want you and your team to figure out how to stop this from happening, because we're not going to continue to prosecute Black and Brown children at this rate. We're not going to continue to co-sign stops where in Oakland or Alameda County, if you're a Black person, you're 20 times more likely to be stopped in this county than a white person. I'm not going to be prosecuting based on those numbers. I want to be, so I can in fact intervene in the phenomenon of racial profiling and take steps to try to ameliorate that, if not completely eliminate it. And that prosecutor, every prosecutor is uniquely positioned to have that kind of impact. And so it's actually more impactful, I think, than having state legislation, to have a prosecutor in place that's prepared to say these things this is racial profiling, this is racism. I'm not going to tolerate it. And we're not going to be prosecuting people based on your practices of, basically unconstitutional policing is not going to be okay in this county. And I intend for everybody to stop doing it. That's my job.
Thank you. Thank you, Pamela. Sajid, you want to?
Yeah, a couple things to frame the conversation around Black Lives Matter. First is I also look up to and really am inspired by Brian Stevenson, who Pamela cited earlier. And I heard him say recently on a podcast, he said, quote, "I think it's really important that people understand that if you're genuinely engaged in recovering from human rights abuses, you have to commit to truth telling first. You can't jump to reconciliation. You can't jump to reparation or restoration until you tell the truth. Until you know the nature of the injuries, you can't actually speak to the kind of remedies that are going to be necessary." And so, echoing what Chesa said in his initial comments, there has to be a recognition from district attorneys' offices of the realities of our system, our criminal legal system, and its roots in systemic and deliberate dehumanization and exploitation of Black lives and in white supremacy. Our elected DAs have to tell the truth about Black and brown communities and how they are systemically prodded and policed and caged and executed by this mass incarceration monster. And this prosecutors have to be able to honestly and truly reflect upon and acknowledge these truths and acknowledge their significant roles in the destruction and dehumanization of Black lives, and apologize for it. Say it out loud. And that's something we haven't seen, for example, from our elected district attorney here, Jeff Rosen. We have to acknowledge that things like police killings are not aberrations, that they are what I call deja vu by design. They are a fundamental feature of our system of mass incarceration. And so until we can tell the truth, we can't really ever truly manifest Black Lives Matter. I also heard another beautiful quote recently from a gentleman named Vijay Prashad. And he said, "When you say Black Lives Matter, you surely don't just mean that killing must stop. Surely you mean that the precious lives of human beings must have access to food, must have access to housing, must have access to education, must have access to healthcare and a broad range of services. Surely it means that the whole preciousness of life, not just that you should be allowed to live. What's the point of living if I can't live with dignity?" And so when we talk about Black Lives Matter and how it interacts with our criminal justice system, it starts with that recognition of truth telling, and then a recognition of the humanity of our Black brothers and sisters, calling people by their names and not their crimes, recognizing context and not just conduct. And we don't do that in our courthouses. We call people by line numbers, and we call people by their rap sheets, and we call them by the color of their jail uniforms, and we reference them by the length of their sentence and by the nature of their crimes. And until we're able to truly recognize the humanity of the people in our system, and then and recognize the humanity of those who have done harm, as opposed to just those who have been harmed, or we can't truly manifest Black Lives Matter. How that interacts with defunding the police or reforming our policing in the Bay Area and in California is a commitment to shrinking the law enforcement footprint. It's a reallocation of resources to services that actually do keep us safe and prevent crime and honor the dignity of our fellow human beings in the way that Mr. Prashad talked about: housing, healthcare, food, education. And we have to think about how much money are we expending investigating and building and prosecuting gang prosecutions that prey upon Black and brown lives. How much money is expended on the war on drugs in our community, both in terms of policing the war on drugs and then prosecuting the war on drugs. So if we think about, if we were to just stop doing those things, stop the prosecution of gang enhancements, stop the war on drugs, how much resources, both on the police level and in our DA's offices, would be freed up to actually promote public safety and the dignity of our fellow human beings. And then lastly, we have to commit to police accountability. I've worked here as a public defender for 12 and a half years, and police accountability it's non-existent. It's quite the opposite. Police are emboldened and perpetuated by our DA's office to violate the dignity of our fellow human beings, to violate the Constitution. When we talk about pretextual stops and racial profiling, district attorneys, as Ms. Price already said, are the ones responsible to pick up that police report and say, no, that stop was unlawful. That stop was rooted in racial animus. That stop was rooted in racial profiling. That was not okay to stop that young man in East San Jose and sit him on a curb and photograph him and search his backpack. I'm not going to prosecute that case because of what that police officer did. That is the duty of the prosecutor to ensure that the values of our Constitution are actually manifested every day. And when we don't do that, when prosecutors don't do that, then it emboldens police officers to continue that behavior. And we know that that behavior exacts generational tolls on communities of color here in San Jose, in Alameda County, and in San Francisco. And so it is no longer protecting police officers when they violate the law, no longer prosecuting cases where there are clear Fourth Amendment violations, not protecting them in court in suppression hearings. And then the corollary to that, as we often see in Santa Clara County, I'm sure we've seen it in San Francisco and Alameda, is when police officers baton and beat and chase and sick dogs upon our fellow human beings unlawfully and excessively. What do our DAs do generally? They turn around and don't prosecute the police officer. They prosecute the victim of the police officer's violence for resisting arrest or for an assault on the police officer, thereby protecting that police officer from any sort of liability. And then lastly, when police officers go as far as killing our fellow human beings, and I'm thankful to Chesa for prosecuting a police officer for that type of fatal violence upon our community, there has to be accountability. The police officers have to be held to account for when they use that sort of fatal violence. It cannot just be something that is done with impunity. I actually just saw a video today of a San Jose police shooting an unarmed man in an apartment complex within 3 seconds of contact of him, claiming that they had seen a weapon. They showed up to this apartment complex looking for this man. He's running across an apartment complex hallway, and they shot him dead with assault weapons. And Santa Clara County has failed to prosecute a single San Jose police officer who has killed a human being in our community in the last 5 years. 18 people in our community have been killed and not a single prosecution. And I'm not hopeful that this set of police officers is going to be held accountable for what they did to this man, Mr. Tovar, in San Jose. So that's how I would answer the question of how we actually manifest Black Lives Matter and how we manifest police accountability in our communities.
Thank you, Sajid. I know these questions are big and ask for a lot of different angles on them. Chesa, I'll turn it over to you. I know at least with the pretextual issue, you've instituted some direct reforms. It'd be great to hear about those and then maybe place it in the broader context of the movements.
Sure, thanks, Matt. And a lot of great points that Pamela and Sajid made. So I don't want to reiterate or echo. I want to try to add a few new things. But there's a couple of really concrete policies that we put in place. And, I think as difficult as my first year in office was because of the pandemic and COVID, and of course, all of the challenges that came to law enforcement in the context of the murder of George Floyd and the massive social uprising, the righteous rage that we saw spill into the streets in the aftermath all across the country. I think my office was really proactive, and I'm proud of the team that helped implement and develop policies to be responsive to and give concrete meaning to the Black Lives Matter movement. So let me give you a couple specific examples. Matt mentioned a pretextual traffic stop policy. So let me just take a minute to explain the context. We've all heard the phrase, we all understand the concept of what it means to drive while black, right? We know that that is a phenomenon, driving while black or brown in this country. We know that people who look like Pamela are far more likely to be stopped while driving than people who look like me. And we know that once stopped, people of color are more likely to be searched. And once searched, more likely to be arrested. And once arrested, more likely to be charged. And once charged, more likely to be detained. And once detained, more likely to waive their rights and plead guilty, regardless of whether or not they have a meritorious defense. And this is not a new phenomenon. This is not something that we only learned about after George Floyd was killed. This is something that has been well documented in cities like San Francisco for decades, literally for decades. This is something that we know traces its roots in many ways all the way back to Jim Crow and to slavery and to efforts by the white ruling class to implement policies and procedures that intentionally and explicitly allow law enforcement to assert social control over people of color. And in San Francisco, we've seen these numbers. We've seen the disproportionate use of traffic stops against people of color for decades. And in 2016, the Obama Department of Justice did a report, a deep dive into San Francisco policing practices. This was not the first time the phenomenon had been documented, but it was a scathing report that made a number of very concrete recommendations for policy changes. And after years, those policy changes had not been forthcoming. And so in the first Black History Month of my tenure as district attorney, even before George Floyd was killed, we announced a policy to ensure that although we don't control police policy, and although we cannot force the police department to make the changes that the Obama Department of Justice urged, we can ensure that going forward, we will not be complicit in widespread civil rights violations. And so what that looked like was a presumption against charging any case involving contraband seized during a search after a pretextual traffic stop. Now, critics will say, well, that means you're going to let someone carrying a gun just get away with it. And I want to be clear. We want to get guns off the street. We also want people living in neighborhoods plagued by gun violence to feel safe and to be safe without the need to carry guns. But we cannot accomplish either of those goals if law enforcement engages in systematic violations of civil rights, if law enforcement behaves in a way that undermines trust between communities impacted by crime and the government agencies that are sworn to serve and protect those communities. And so, yes, if police seize an illegal gun, we will destroy it. We will not return it. We are glad there's one less gun on the street, but we will not file a criminal case stemming from an interaction that is at its core racist. That's one example of a policy we put in place. There's a number of others that we put in place, and advocated for in response to the Black Lives Matter movement. Let me just touch on one other policy. I could go into detail about maybe a dozen, but one other one I think is important and harkens back to the comments that Sajid and Pam made. We know that historically, when police have used excessive force, when they've racially profiled, when I think Sajid mentioned, dogs and horrific beatings, the kinds of things that we've all seen on social media and in videos, some of them going back decades, right? Practices that have come to define in many ways the relationship between communities of color and law enforcement. Traditionally, those kinds of interactions result in the victim of violence being prosecuted. They result in a district attorney's office filing charges like resisting arrest or assault on an officer. And I want to be clear, when people assault officers, we take that very seriously. We can and we will prosecute those cases. But we cannot and will not be complicit in using those charges to cover up, justify, or excuse police violence. And so I implemented a policy to ensure that we know exactly what we're doing in these cases. That requires my assistant district attorneys to review body-worn camera footage or other available surveillance prior to making a charging decision in one of those cases. And if we find that it was the officers rather than the person they arrested who were at fault for using excessive force, then we refer that case to our independent investigation bureau that's responsible for investigating and prosecuting police use of force. And in fact, we filed, I think I mentioned earlier, 3 separate cases involving police excessive force, and we're actively investigating numerous other cases. Those are just a couple of the concrete examples of the kinds of things that I've done, that my office has done, and that we hope will serve as models for other people who are genuinely committed to earning the term progressive prosecutor in their work and in their practice.
Thank you for that, Chesa. We did have one question come in concerning whether or not any of your policies are available to the public. If you want to.
Yeah, they are. Give me a minute. I'll try to pull up a link and put it in the chat for folks. Our policies should all be available to the public. If the sort of formal written policy itself is not on our website, then at least a description and summary of it is. So I'll put a couple links in the chat while we move on to the next question for folks.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, before we move on, Matt, I just want to share that I can recall in 1984, when I worked at the Bayview Hunters Point, that it was always understood that anybody arrested in an interaction with the police was going to be charged with a 148, resisting arrest, or assault on a police officer. That was just like standard. You're going to have to fight that, because whatever happened on the street was exactly as Chesa pointed out. It was going to be covered up by these charges to protect the officers from having to answer for any kind of misconduct.
Yeah. Well, no, thank you for that. I mean, it is one of the reasons why all of you are in this arena, where whether you're a declared candidate or considering it or have won an election, realities that, you know, many of us have been fighting against for very long, and taking over the reins of decision making is, you know, the fastest way to implement those changes. Sajid, on the next question, we'll start with you. You know, the question is that, you know, many folks coming out of the criminal defense community or civil rights work are increasingly running for, even winning positions, prosecutorial positions. Obviously, as defense attorneys, candidates can face special problems winning the trust of the electorate. I would say that just that natural difficulty is exacerbated by things like the police unions that often oppose any kind of reform. And so I'd be interested in your thoughts about how you address that, and how do you convince people that you can be trusted with the role of top law enforcement person in a particular county and address public safety. And I'll just add, from one of the questions that has been posted, even a candidate like George Gascon, who has a law enforcement background and served as a former prosecutor, starts to implement reforms that seem consistent with the movements we talked about earlier, and he gets a tremendous amount of backlash. So I'll turn that over to you. Maybe we can do 4 or 5 minutes on it.
Sure. Well, I will say that we as public defenders, I as a public defender, we are experts. We have tremendous insight and experiences through the work that we do. We sit in the jail. We sit in the juvenile hall interview rooms. We talk to the people that are accused of crimes by county prosecutors. We hear their stories and their backgrounds and understand the root causes of their crimes if they are in fact true as alleged. We understand and witness that many, if not all of the people that I have had the privilege and honor of representing have too been victims themselves, have suffered from poverty, family separation, incarceration, racism, abuse. We understand what the people that who we represent need in order need from the system so that they don't hurt again, so that they're not hurting themselves and they're not hurting our communities. But we also read the police reports, we watch the witness interviews, we cross-examine those that have been harmed in our courtrooms. I have sat and listened to the testimonies of families of loved ones who have been hurt by people in our community, people who have lost loved ones in our community, and bared witness to their plight and to their trauma and their hurt. And with that, we again, I have accrued significant empathy and understanding for the full scope of humanity in our community, and a recognition that there is actually not a vast sea of difference between those who have done harm and those who have been harmed, that we are all collectively human beings that require the same dignities that I alluded to earlier: housing, healthcare, education, support, healing from the inevitable traumas of living life as a human being. And we also bear witness to the destruction that this system imposes on individual people and on communities of color in places like Santa Clara County. We've already alluded to the destructive practices of racist gang enhancements and 3 strikes prosecutions and death penalty prosecutions and the war on drugs. And so when we talk about defense attorneys like Chesa, like Pamela, and trying to take that leap from the defense bar to leading DA's offices, I would submit and argue that we are uniquely situated to be the leaders of these offices, given our unique experiences in as defenders and bearing witness to the people we serve, as well as to how our system operates. In terms of pushback, our systems of mass incarceration and our systems of the dehumanization of Black lives are deeply rooted constructs. They are not going to be overturned overnight. This is a cultural battle that we have to kind of strap up for and be ready to fight. Matt, you ran for DA in 1999? And so this battle is not going to end anytime soon. It's not going to end with Chesa. It's not going to end with George. It is going to be this perpetual battle, but we're going to chip away little by little, and we're going to get out on the other side. I don't know when that'll be, but I think that's what we have to recognize, that these are deeply rooted cultural constructs of mass incarceration, dehumanization of Black and brown lives, and that we just have to be ready and willing to continue to fight and put our voices and bodies on the line to ensure that values of mercy, compassion, redemption, empathy, humanity are manifested in our community, despite our instincts to resort back to instincts of vengeance and anger and fear and hostility.
Thank you, Sajid. For Chesa and Pamela, when you guys tackle the question, of course, you're in a little bit different posture because you've actually run the campaigns, and in Chesa, your case, you've been elected. And I know that you could talk about this for a really long time, but if you can share any instance of like how you've addressed that that trust, public safety trust, or been accused of not being capable of doing it. I'll turn it over to you, Chesa.
Oh, well, the accusations are constant. I mean, that's, one of the things that we're up against is a culture that for decades has conflated public safety and justice and even accountability with punishment. And the calls we see even in progressive San Francisco on social media and in a lot of our local news coverage are very explicitly to detain people pre-trial without regard to the presumption of innocence, without regard to their criminal history or lack thereof, without regard to due process or the risk of COVID in the jails. We see, and I feel, tremendous pressure every day to hold people in jail, even in cases where there's not nearly enough evidence for me to charge a case, much less prove it. And criticism for being unwilling to charge a case until we have all the evidence, for example, DNA or blood test results, basic things. We see a very real double standard when it comes to how people talk about and even local press coverage of criminal justice outcomes in a jurisdiction like mine compared to, say, San Mateo or Alameda County, where we have much more traditional prosecutors, really any other county. In San Francisco, the message that comes across is any crime that occurs is my fault, even if it's someone who has zero criminal history. Even in cases where it's someone's first arrest as an adult and where my office charges the case as murder, the most serious case, most serious charge, the most serious consequences that exist under the law, we take tremendous amounts of criticism because people want me to use rhetoric that demeans and dehumanizes the person we are prosecuting. And if we don't use that language and that rhetoric, if we don't use catchphrases like fullest extent of the law, if we don't try and prejudge and pre-try the case in the press in ways that undermine constitutional rights of those accused, then that gets twisted to suggest that we are not only responsible for the crime, but that we don't care about the victims. So I want to go back to something that Sajid mentioned. We looked at the folks that we've served in my victim services division in the past year, and I'm really proud of the work that my victim services team does. It's the most diverse team in my office in terms of language and religion and cultural fluency. It's also, sadly, the team that gets paid the least because of the MOUs negotiated with the city. And it's a team that's funded almost entirely by grants. This is not an area where the city is investing in victim services, right? This is something that I'm demanding. It's the primary request in my budget going into the next fiscal year is to significantly expand victim services. Because I believe if we're gonna justify the kinds of draconian lock them up and throw away the key policies that proliferated over the 90s and early 2000s in the name of victims, that A, we should put our money where our mouth is and actually fund the kinds of services and support systems that will help victims heal from crime and from trauma. And second of all, we need to stop this myth that on the one hand, there are good people who are crime victims, and on the other hand, there are bad people who are criminals. Because the reality is, and we see this every day in our work, the person we are prosecuting in courtroom number 11 is a victim in a crime being prosecuted in courtroom number 12. We see it every day. Now, it doesn't mean that we should dismiss the charges, but it means we need to recognize the complexity, the humanity, the multidimensionality of every single person who our cases touch. And we're not doing a good job. We're not doing good enough, right? We need to lift up and restore victims, but that's not what prosecutors around the country are doing. The traditional prosecutors, the ones that don't get the kinds of attacks progressives like me suffer, in many instances will jail victims. That's right. They will jail victims so that they're available to testify. They're being treated as nothing more than a piece of evidence, right? Material witnesses. They're held in custody so that they can be available on short notice to come into court and help secure a conviction. That's not victims' rights. That's not dignity or compassion for people who've been harmed by crime. That doesn't understand or get at the root complex issues that drive hurt people to hurt other people. And so if we're serious about building safe communities, if we're truly dedicated to helping heal victims of crime, then we need to take a close look at the ways in which our policies that have led to racism and mass incarceration are contributing to and perpetuating violence and crime in our communities. We need to make sure that every single time a district attorney is brought in arrest, it's not viewed as an opportunity to punish or to virtue signal to right-wing forces that want racist mass incarceration policies to be perpetuated, but rather it's an opportunity to intervene in ways that transform lives away from crime. And we must recognize that look, let me just be really concrete. Let's use numbers. In San Francisco, 75% of people booked into our county jail are drug addicted, mentally ill, or both. Now, that's not a legal justification for committing a crime in most cases. I know Matt has some lawyers on his team who will make a compelling argument about mental health, and the law allows that in some cases. But the reality is, if we don't understand the challenges that people we're prosecuting are facing, how can we ever expect them to succeed when they rejoin our community? And if we don't recognize that access to housing and to healthcare and to employment and to housing and to education, all those core fundamental socioeconomic rights that are denied to so many members of our community, if we don't recognize the role that those sorts of upstream problems play in contributing to insecurity and to crime and to violence, then we will never be able to build a safe community, no matter how many young Black and brown men we incarcerate, no matter how long we put them in cages for. Because remember, this country incarcerates more people than any other country on earth. And this country has become so reliant on incarceration that it's not just something experienced by a few people over there. All of us are touched and connected to the prison system. The majority of American adults have an immediate family member who is either currently or formerly incarcerated. It has become a defining part of American culture. And until we change that, until we find alternative ways to engage with social problems and to heal and support crime victims and to dignify their suffering and to hold people accountable in ways that are not always synonymous with longer punishment, we are not ever going to have safe communities.
Thank you. Thank you, Chesa. And Pamela, from your last campaign, I'm wondering how you addressed these issues, whether or not you could be entrusted with public safety. I know Larry Krasner had to deal with it, Tiffany Caban, it's out there, so.
Mm-hmm. Right. So I believe, and I know that everyone on this panel believes, you have to run on your own values and your principles. And one of the bedrock principles that we say that we were taught, all of us in law school, is the presumption of innocence. And we have a criminal justice system that completely ignores that. You know, they tell you this in law school, and then you get in the real world and you see, no, there's a presumption of guilt. And so it's our responsibility as progressive prosecutors to hold fast to the constitutional. And that's where I feel like I am compelled to educate my community. The Constitution says that one is presumed innocent until proven guilty. And so my job is not, I am not, and I push back on this notion that I'm the top law enforcement official. No, I'm not. That's the sheriff, okay? That is not me. I am the minister of justice. My obligation is to administer justice in this community and to make sure that it's done fairly. And that's my job, okay? And yes, I'm supposed to prosecute people, but I'm sure all of us were inspired by Adam Foss, who said, we want to hire prosecutors that want to change lives and not destroy them. And that's really where we have to go with that. I believe in the presumption of innocence. I also am proud to say that our first slogan was justice with compassion, and it is still justice with compassion. And it means not just compassion for the person who has committed the crime, because I understand that everybody at some point has a bad day and people do bad things, hurt people. And, you know, I've got to hold people accountable, but I've also got to recognize that none of us wants to be judged by the worst thing we've ever done in our lives. And so I got to look at that, the person who is accused of crime, and recognize this is a human being. And this person did something, it might have been really, really bad. And maybe they didn't even know they were doing it. There's a whole lot of things behind people who commit crimes. But justice with compassion doesn't just speak to those who are charged with crimes. As Chesa points out, justice with compassion is for people who have been the victim of crimes. I was a victim of crime. I was a domestic violence survivor, and I ended up being prosecuted by the Alameda County District Attorney's Office. Okay. I have great compassion for people, whether you're a victim or whether you're someone that's perpetrated a crime. And I think that's where the value that I start from, that I bring to this. I have a record as a civil rights lawyer of having tremendous compassion for victims, because the people that I have represented have been the victims most often of official misconduct, of retaliation, of discrimination. And so I've had to walk with folks and balance that, as I need to both be there for my clients and shore them up for the battles that we're fighting, but at the same time be very clear with the people that I'm holding accountable. I'm not playing with you, okay? And people underestimate this little short Black woman. I am not playing with you when I'm in a courtroom. Understand that. And they find that out probably too late, later than they want to know it. Okay. But as you say, in our community, you better ask somebody. If you come in with me, you better come correct. Okay. Because I'm not playing with you. If I think you did something wrong, I'm going to hold you accountable. And there are tools that can do that. But I also understand that public safety requires public trust. I've represented the victims of violence in this community. I've represented people who did not get victim services, families who did not, women and families who didn't get treated fairly by the district attorney's office, and had to press to try to get justice for them. People should not have to look for justice outside the criminal justice system. They need to be able to find it inside the system as well. And so that's our charge. And I think we have to build up the victim services units and really look at, in Alameda County, we need a way more robust witness protection program, because I represented the family of a young man who witnessed a crime and then he got killed, and there was like no redress. In Alameda County, the homicide solve rate, or in the city of Oakland, the homicide solve rate is only 30%. That's ridiculous. And that's what's documented in Oakland. I don't know what it is in Fremont. I want to know that. And as a district attorney, it's my responsibility to say, how are you allocating your resources? Are you really dealing with the kind of violent crimes and the crimes that really are impacting the lives of people? Don't bring me these quality of life things, because I agree, those are public health issues that I am not going to be able to solve as a district attorney. So
thank you. Thank you for that.
yes.
So if the panelists don't mind, with the next question, I really just want to direct it to Chesa, who's in office and had to confront this head on. And then maybe I'll toss it back to Whitney, who can ask questions, maybe one or two questions coming from our audience. Chesa, the question I have for you is just, when you took office, obviously you inherited staff, and there are a lot of complicated things that you have to balance, both winning the trust of your staff, but also wanting them to be able to implement your progressive ideas, and having to make those difficult decisions about replacing staff, and building a culture where your deputies understand that you get to decide policy and it's their duty to get behind that. Maybe you could just share some thoughts about that, and I'm sure Pamela and Sajid would appreciate, just hearing your experience.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is a real issue with any bureaucracy, or even with companies. We see it in the corporate sector as well. But people who choose to be district attorneys, who choose to work in district attorneys' offices, mostly have the opportunity to go to other places, to go to law firms, to make more money. And they choose to do this work primarily because they believe in public service, and they believe that this is a role that allows them to contribute to their community. And so there's a little bit of a tension when someone with new, bold ideas comes in and in essence says, hey, the way you've been doing this is wrong. The way you've been doing this is racist. The way you've been doing this is hurting rather than helping. And that's something that is really explicit in the kinds of campaign promises that true progressive candidates for prosecutor make. So there's inevitably going to be a tension with a new leader who gets elected, who has run a campaign that is explicitly critical of a bureaucracy made up of individual people who have chosen this career and who've been in this role for decades in some cases, because they believe they're doing good things. They don't really want to see their work undone by resentencing or changing policies that yesterday they were zealously pursuing. There is inevitably some resistance. And what that resistance looks like and how you respond to it depends in large part, I think, on the particular rules of your administration. In Los Angeles County, for example, we're seeing not just the kinds of low-level, quiet undermining of DA Gascon's policies, but we're seeing the union representing his assistant district attorney suing him and suing to prevent his policies from being implemented. And one of the reasons they can do that is because they have civil service protection, as many government workers do. In San Francisco County, as you know, Matt, lawyers, whether in your office or mine, are not given the benefit of civil service protection. They are considered at-will employees. And that inevitably changes the nature of the relationship between labor and management. It makes it easier to implement new policies. It makes it harder for staff to resist those policies. There's also the question of scale. And the policies that were, some of the policies that were implemented in LA were policies framed as across-the-board prohibitions. And part of the reason for that is LA is the biggest criminal justice jurisdiction in the country. There's over 1,000 staff members in that office, well over 1,000. And there's dozens of courthouses across LA County. And so to implement a policy and actually have it take effect, it's far simpler to say, this is the policy, there are no exceptions. Most of the policies that I put in place, because San Francisco is smaller, because we've got one criminal courthouse, because I personally tried dozens of cases to verdict in front of juries in our courthouse. I know the judges, I know the lawyers in my office and in the public defender's office and in the private defense bar. It was much easier, it was much more practical for me to say, this is the policy. Any exception to the policy has to come through me. So if a lawyer believes that a case truly presents exceptional circumstances, whatever the issue is, right? Whether it's a pretextual traffic stop or our prohibition on 3 strikes, priors or gang charges. If there are exceptional circumstances, then bring it to me personally and I'll make a decision about whether we should make an exception to the policy. That is both effective from a management standpoint, from a staff buy-in standpoint, from a legal standpoint in terms of the kinds of challenges we've seen brought in LA. And that's what I've been able to do because of the particular circumstances. But I also want to point out something that Jeff Adachi said to me shortly before he died about culture. Jeff had been a career public defender in the San Francisco Public Defender Office. It's where he practiced almost his entire life. And just about 2 years before his election to become the public defender, he'd been in the role you're now in, Matt, as the chief attorney in the office, a critical leadership role in the office. And then there's some history I don't need to rehash, but Jeff and others were forced out of the office. There was about a 2-year period where Jeff was in private practice campaigning to become the public defender. And he won that election and then was public defender until his untimely death. Jeff told me that after he won re-election, with just 2 years of his legal career not in that office, having recently been in a leadership role, he said that it took years to get the culture of the office to a place where he really felt comfortable with it. And remember, that's an office that he had been in, that he had been helping to lead just 2 years prior. So imagine the amount of time and the amount of work that it will take for someone who's truly an outsider, right? Who's never been, like someone like me who had never been in the district attorney's office, who had never been an assistant district attorney in any office, coming in, viewed by some with hostility, whose ideas may call into question some of my staff's very identity, there is inevitably going to be resistance to change. And that resistance is going to take many different forms. And getting past it requires a number of things at once. It requires, first of all, courage in my convictions that the policies I'm implementing will further justice and safety. It requires the confidence in some cases to release staff members from employment who cannot or will not get on board with the policies that I promised the voters of San Francisco I would implement. We were transparent. We were clear about what I was going to do. There's nobody is surprised by the policies we put in place. We are following through on one campaign promise after another. And so if folks are unwilling or unable to accept that that is what the voters want, then they should work in other offices. And that's okay. We need some amount of turnover in our staff. And it also requires earning the trust of my staff by showing that I am committed to them and to the office and to building an office that is a world-class public law firm where we practice good law with high ethical standards, where we have competent trial lawyers, where we are creative and flexible in how we resolve cases, and where we actually care about the people whose lives are touched. And it means leading by example in all of those ways. Rolling up my sleeves, I personally presented a murder case to a grand jury to secure an indictment in a case that had languished for years. I personally handle arraignment calendars. I personally show up in court and help resolve cases, even sometimes misdemeanors where there are problems. I think that level of hands-on involvement both shows that trying to undermine my policies is not going to work. I'm going to notice. And it also shows that I am genuinely committed to doing the work it takes to move our caseloads forward, to support our staff and everything from their public safety and public health in the context of COVID, to ensuring that caseloads are manageable, to getting the kind of physical space that people need to work productively. All of those little things go into building and earning trust from the staff that I'm asking to implement my vision and the vision of the people of the city and county of San Francisco.
Whitney, you want to take it from there?
Sure. Thanks, Matt. Pamela, I'd like to ask the first question from the audience, put that to you. As regards police behavior, is the problem more about individual police officers, or is it more about police procedures and relying on heavy use of violence as a matter of training and procedures, or both? From your experience, can you speak to this issue?
Sure. It's both, and it's bigger than that. It's the entire culture of policing as it has evolved in this country. It's the warrior mentality that we look for and expect police officers to have. It's what draws some people to become police officers. And, you know, I've been in experiences, I understand very clearly when you're dealing often in a police officer, when they show up, there is an intent to subdue and gain control of the situation. And the first person who challenges the officer is the one who's likely to go to jail. Okay. And so it's the whole way in which policing is thought about, created, maintained, and it's infused in the training, it's infused in the culture. The blue shield, or the code of silence that is really problematic, because if an officer does see another officer violate the law or violate the Constitution or hurt somebody, everybody is expected to be quiet about that. And if you have the audacity or the courage to speak up against misconduct within the police ranks, you are not likely to survive there. And that's been my experience representing officers who have challenged misconduct. So it's the entire way that departments are used to functioning and the role that they see themselves having. And so I don't ascribe to there are few good, bad officers, or I think the system is all screwed up, and that people who are trying to function, when you put good people into a bad system, it's like pouring good wine into an old bottle. It's not going to work. You can't do it. And it's going to have problems. And people who go in there with the best of intentions are often not able to survive. And I've seen officers come out of those systems where they managed to adjust to be able to survive for decades, 30, years or so. And then when they come out of that system and they're now in the regular world, in the real world with everyday people, they just completely dissemble because they don't know how to function as part of a community that does not involve authority or force. So I see it as a real problem with the culture that is reflected in the training, that's reflected in the interactions that we see, the leadership. It's just problems from top to bottom that have to be addressed.
Thank you very much. Sajid, I'm going to ask you the question. I'm going to another question so we can get more questions asked. But if one of the previous answers has something that you want to comment on, feel free to do so. So the next question for you is, how much is economic justice in our society necessary to make qualitative improvements in criminal justice?
Oh, it's absolutely critical. Having represented people accused of and convicted of crime, especially theft crimes like robberies and burglaries, petty thefts, even things like selling of controlled substances. When we dig deeper, we recognize that the roots of those crimes are poverty. The roots of those crimes are often desperation. The roots of those crimes are often the stark class disparities that exist in our neighborhoods and in our counties and in our cities, where people are unable to live dignified lives as human beings, where they don't have consistent housing, where they don't have the basic amenities that we all seek and desire, like uh, a comfortable home, healthcare, education, clothes that conform with societal kind of expectations and standards, food. And so what that results in oftentimes are crimes of desperation. I had my car broken into, my window smashed in a couple years back when I was at a Redwood City library. And I came back to find my car broken into and my bags inside stolen. And I was curious, more than angry, I was curious as to what would have driven this person, whoever did it, to be so desperate to be kind of looking through cars and taking the means and measures of breaking my window to steal some clothing from my car. What would have led someone to be in that position? Poverty or mental illness or substance abuse or family issues, or the combination of all those things. And so when we want to address true public safety, as Chesa and Ms. Price have discussed, we have to really address the root causes of what drives crime in our communities and address them and heal those root causes. When we have, Chesa is now the sitting DA in San Francisco. Pamela is attempting to do so in Alameda. When someone comes into our system because they've been arrested for a crime, it's an opportunity for intervention as opposed to an opportunity for punishment. It's an opportunity for healing as opposed to an opportunity for exacerbating the traumas and struggles that this person's already suffering from. And so when we have that person come into the grips of the criminal justice system, we should explore root causes of crime and attempt to alleviate them, leave them better off than when they came in. I think Chesa has talked to me about this before. I've heard him say, we don't want to see people come back into our system. As a public defender, the worst feeling for me is when I see someone a second time or a third time. It is miserable. It is not something that makes me happy or smile to have a repeat client. My goal as a public defender and my hope and what makes me full and content is to have that, is that I never see that person again, or that I see them thriving in the community. And the way we do that is to address base human needs, as was alluded to in the form of the question. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Chase, I've got a question for you. There are a lot of progressives that are watching that support policies that you're trying to implement. what do you recommend that the Californians themselves do to support progressive prosecution and to support reform on the state and local level?
Well, there's so much work to be done to support this work. There's so much pressure to exploit high-profile tragedies and use them to justify failed racist policies and to roll back criminal justice reform and to demonize people who are trying to build a better system. But one of the challenges that I face and that we all face is it's not just getting progressive candidates elected. It's not just helping to create the political space for people, like me and like others on this panel to take office. That's critical, to be sure. But it's also, once we're in office, we need to do the work of building out the kinds of social safety net and infrastructure that allow for those alternatives. It's a little bit like we're flying an airplane and we're trying to build a different kind of plane in midair. We can't simply just, in my view, stop prosecuting serious and violent crimes because we recognize the failings of our system that led those crimes to occur. We still need a mechanism to protect the public. We need a mechanism to hold people who commit crimes accountable. And so while we're doing that, the faster we can build out and expand treatment beds, the faster we can provide meaningful employment opportunities to people who, like the person who broke into Sajid's car, maybe didn't have better economic opportunities or ways to earn their living. The more we can do that, the more we can find effective pretrial release programming and supervision, the more we'll be able to show the public that these policies succeed. And so a lot of that work is not best done by district attorneys, right? Especially if we're in a conversation around defunding law enforcement, which I know many folks on the left have been promoting. If the goal is to say, well, we want less resources going to police or to prosecutors, which I know many advocate, then we're going to end up having less resources in my office to do things like hold police accountable, things like resentence people who've been in prison for a long time, things like staff our drug courts or our veterans justice courts. And so if that's what folks are advocating for, make sure you're doing the work in the community to help ensure that everybody we release, whether it be after 20 years in prison or whether it be after a weekend in jail on a new arrest where they're presumed innocent, is not getting rearrested, because those stories will and are being exploited by the right. They're being held out as somehow exemplary or representative of our policies. The data shows that's not true, but the anecdotal stories that are held up are tremendously damaging to our movement. And so the more we can do to ensure the alternatives to incarceration are successful, the more successful we as a movement will be.
Well, it's now 2:00, and I would like to thank everyone who's joined us. First, Jake Tonko, I want to thank him for facilitating this, and thanks to Matt for being such a great moderator, and thanks so much to our excellent panelists, Pamela Price, Sajid Khan, and Chesa Boudin. Really appreciate you all coming today. I think this has been just an excellent panel.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for having us and thank you for doing this. This is so
Thanks so much.
important. We appreciate the
thank you.
support. Thank you.
Great speaking with you all.
All
Yeah,
right. Then.
Lisa, thanks, Pamela. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thank
Thank
you. Bye-bye. Nice to meet you.